Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode. Today, I've got Aaron Yassin on the show. Aaron is a design driven developer building ground up new construction apartments in Brooklyn. He's got over 20 years of experience in the real estate space and the fields of design and fine art. He holds a unique position in the development space. Aaron has won multiple design awards, including a prestigious Architizer A Plus Award. He's worked with world-renowned architects, artists, and designers, as well as Tiffany and Company, the Related Group, and the Museum of Modern Art. I'm very interested. One thing he's written on here that I'm very interested to jump in is how his first real estate investment produced a 70x return. We're definitely going to get into that today. But first, Aaron, welcome to the show, man. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Brandon. I really appreciate it. It's great to
Hey,
connect.
it's a big honor. I have not had somebody with when we met. I remember we met at that conference and we were having lunch or dinner, and you were talking about art. And I could tell you were super passionate with art, and this fits perfect into your background as an architect. So I'm really interested to go into your background and some nuances today on how like the role architecture plays in development and construction, because it really is important, right? The emotional response that buyers get from things, that's the reason why they buy, and architecture plays a huge role in that. But before we jump into it, why not give the audience a little background and story on yourself? How'd you get to what you were doing today?
Okay, fantastic. That's absolutely a great place to start. I'm going to try to condense this a little bit, and you can pick any pieces out of it that you like to expand upon. So my background is that I'm an artist, a visual artist. And like a lot of artists, it's often something said about artists is that you don't become an artist, you just always are an artist. So
Yeah.
I've always made things from even when I was a small child, I was making different things, which of course is a great segue into actually building things because you're always making something, right? And making a building, I can kind of connect the dots a little bit later, but making a building is also making something, of course, it's just bigger. So I was always making, working, picking things up, putting things together, and really thinking visually, but thinking in relationship to materials. And part of I would say, the unique background that I have is that my father is trained as an art historian, and he moved from that kind of academic setting into a more administrative setting. In his career, for his career, he was a art museum director. So when I grew up, which was in Indianapolis, Indiana, my father was the director of the Indianapolis Museum of Art. So there was I had a relationship to, just what he was doing in this
Mm-hmm.
place that is definitely unique. I know a lot of people feel sometimes a little put off by an art museum, and that it's something that, they go to rarely, and they don't feel this, they have a way to enter into what it is that they're looking at, because there's a lot of pretense
Mm-hmm.
around art, which I fully agree with. It's definitely there, and it's easy to just be put off by that and not be able to kind of enter into the dialogue. So I had access in a way that was definitely unique. Met a lot of artists and just was able to understand something about what was going on, and also the passion that all these people had for making things. It was always, really exciting to me as a child, and I continued just making lots of different things, and I, continued to just develop, and then, made the decision, instead of going to a, typical 4-year college, I went to art school in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So it's a fantastic school, and just, what you can experience there is really, it's a really very, very unique place with people doing amazing things in multiple different departments, working with different materials and media. They don't have a full-on architecture program. There is an interior architecture department, but I was
Mm-hmm.
really focused very much in fine arts. And I went on from that position, and then I went to graduate school in Washington, D.C. at American University. Although in the middle of that, and even while I was in Chicago, and this is definitely really, I've always had a strong interest in architecture. And
Uh-huh.
Chicago's a great place for it because it's one of the great architectural cities in the United States. Is really, the skyscraper was born in Chicago for people that aren't aware of that. And this, if anyone that's going to Chicago, I highly recommend an architecture tour. It's incredible, beautifully designed city as well. More to discuss there. But so I worked for a while in Chicago for an industrial designer who went to the Illinois Institute of Technology, which has a remarkable architecture school, and it's also the legacy of the Bauhaus from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Many professors that were escaping World War II moved to Chicago and started the Design Institute at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And so the person I was working for had studied there, and his father also was an architect. So he had this very strong background. He worked for a very significant and was a partner at a very significant architecture firm in Chicago, Harry Weiss and Associates. So I was really immersed into that dialogue and discussion while I was also, working and making fine art. And then after I graduated, I worked at a wood shop for a couple of years in Chicago. We made a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright prototypes and replicas. It was really great experience. And I was working with a bunch of artists also. And so there was always this very strong connection between art and architecture. But then,
Mm-hmm.
how do you jump from that to actually get involved with real estate, right?
Yeah.
So it's not an unusual path just for the mechanics of it, because what happens is that, as an artist, you need a space, right? And an actual physical space.
And it helps if it makes money.
And there you go. There you go. And why can't it if you can figure out a way to get it to make money? So one of the first properties that I purchased was one that I had my studio in, and I was renting it. And the guys that owned the building came to me and said, we're thinking about selling the building. And I said, well, maybe I can buy it from you. And so we worked out a contract, and actually purchased it directly from the owners without a broker or an agent involved. And there were three. This is a small multifamily, plus this commercial space. So there were three
Mm-hmm.
rental units in it, and it was definitely, covered all my costs for the studio. And then, as the rents went up and I did some value add to the building, the rents increased and I had some cash flow on top of it. So that was terrific. And that definitely, got me interested in real estate as an investment, in addition to the fact that, I was able to kind of work on the buildings and understand the mechanics of it and have an interest in the architecture and design of the buildings as well. And so with that in mind, my interest was always, well, if I'm going to continue doing this, it would be more aligned with my goals and objectives if I can build something rather than just renovating existing multifamily buildings.
Yeah, you're limited when you're doing a renovation where there's a clean space with anything you
Right.
want to do if it's new construction. I'm curious because this popped up while you were talking. I'm very interested because you have the art background, and I know that people are thinking this. How in the world does art get valued? I mean, do you have some expertise there? I've always wondered how supply and demand and pricing for art, because I'm like, why is this painting valued at a gajillion dollars and nobody wants to buy this one? Like, did you have any experience with your dad having that background?
Sure, sure. I mean, and this is it's a very good question, and you really hit on the main driver, that it is very much about supply and demand. But a lot of the demand is somewhat artificial.
Uh-huh.
So, there are artists that are promoted, within kind of the art world, or the market, the art market. And it's not, and so I think one thing that's very important to understand is that it's not, the value of a lot of work is not a direct reflection of the quality of the work itself.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it is, but there are many artists that I know whose work is fantastic,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just not great at marketing their work.
Yeah.
And it will have a lower value because there's no market to it. You have to kind of create a
Your own
market.
market. Yeah.
And,
It's
and
it's
there's
like I think Robert Kiyosaki was sitting down with this journalist, I remember, and he was talking in his book, and she was like, "Man, I just really want to be a a best-selling author and sell, and I'm very passionate about writing. He's like, well, have you read my books? Like, yeah, no, I read it. And honestly, can I give you some opinion on it? And he said, sure. What? She's like, it was not, it was okay. He goes, well, I know it was okay. He goes, what does it say on here though? She's like, well, what do you mean? I go, well, have you learned any sales skills at all? She's like, no, I don't want to learn any sales skills or marketing skills. She's like, she was kind of looking down upon it. And he's like, well, you need to. She's like, well, I don't want to. I don't want to do that. And he goes, well, look at what the book says. It doesn't say best written book. It says best selling
Right.
book.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it
I mean,
sounds like that's
and
similar.
that's yes. But in also what's interesting just from a marketing standpoint is when we discuss this very often, right? You sell through stories,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if you can create a great story around an artist or an artist's work, then that can be a critical factor in driving the value of their work. And certainly, an artist that everyone is familiar with, there's a great story around him, Vincent van Gogh, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
People know the story, whether it's true or not, it's really not true, but it doesn't really matter. But and what's interesting with Van Gogh is that during his lifetime, his work had no value. None of it was sold, or very little of it was sold, even by his brother, who was actually an art dealer. He was unable to successfully sell his brother's work. And after his death, his brother's wife was able to create a market for Vincent's work. She brought a number of the paintings to New York and staged an exhibition. And that began the process of creating this myth of Van Gogh as the quintessential modern artist who struggled for his work,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then there's the laws of scarcity as well, because there are only so many paintings that he made. So you have that as a factor. So what tends to work best in the market is something that's aligned with that. And there are some other artists who have a similar story. Recently, or not, maybe not so recently, but he died about 30 years ago. Another American artist whose work may be of the highest value at this point, Basquiat. Maybe you've heard of his work also. The numbers, particularly at auction, are extraordinary. But he didn't live very long. He died tragically, and the story is phenomenal. And the work has some level of interest also,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a very limited supply of his work. And
Yeah.
that is an enormous driver in the value. And then you also have from there a degree of market manipulation, and that's intentional market manipulation. Have artists like Damien Hirst, who's a British artist, who has famously purchased his work back at auction. So he'll
Oh,
buy
wow.
his own work back just to maintain the price or to create a certain degree of scarcity to it. So there's a lot of manipulation that occurs. The art market is probably the largest unregulated market in the world.
Yeah. Very unregulated.
And there's a lot of you know there's a lot of mystery in it, but it's also a lot of money laundering that's involved.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a thing. Well, cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I've always been curious about that, and you're probably the first person I've talked to who has like a background in that. All right, so I really want to know this. That switching gears here a little bit, I want to get into some of the investment in architecture and like balancing the budget with architecture, because I know we struggle with that, and getting into the architecture and how you get your inspiration for that, because that really is what sells homes and buildings and real estate, is the emotional attachment that somebody can get
Absolutely.
to it. But so
Absolutely.
this was crazy though. You said, like, how did you get a 70x return on your first real estate investment in Jersey City? Walk us through that story.
Okay, so I'm going to try to condense it so it's pretty easy to understand. So I purchased a condominium, right? I was I moved to New York. Jersey City's right across the river, so I was, looking for some place that, had the right kind of metrics, right cost structure, where I could
Mm-hmm.
be very close to Manhattan. And I was looking around for an apartment. And it turned out that I could potentially buy something for a very similar cost as it was going to cost to rent an apartment. Not just the monthly cost, but the actual cost to get into the apartment, right? So if I was renting, it was first month's rent, last month's rent, broker fee, and security deposit, right? And they were about $1,000 for an apartment. So every one of those is $1,000, about $4,000, right? And I was looking around then at potential apartments to look at. I mean, it was really kind of coincidental. I was waiting for a broker. He got stuck on a phone call, and in Jersey, there's the old MLS kind of magazines you could look at. I picked one up and noticed that there were a few condominium units, basically right where I was looking, that were around $80,000.
Oh,
So,
wow.
very, very reasonably priced. And at the time, you could purchase an apartment for very little down, right? 5%, 10%. So I was like, hey, can we just go look at these instead of looking at apartments to rent? And he was like, sure. So we went to look at a couple of them. And, based on what I was looking to rent, they were much better, noticeably better because there's a lot of who knows what renovation in Jersey City for on the rental side, older buildings. So, I just looked at a few and I put an offer in on one full price. The offer, of course, was accepted. And then I was actually I included some closing costs in the mortgage and it didn't cost that much. So that balanced out a little bit. So I ended up probably putting around $5,000
Oh, wow. Okay.
into the purchase. So that was all the cash in that I had on the apartment. It had been renovated. I didn't have to do any renovation work. $5,000, right? And of course, it's a mortgage. I didn't pay for a month.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of excess. And actually, the cost monthly was less than the $1,000 I was going to pay to rent. It was like $800 or something. So like 15-20% less. So I'm locked in. I'm paying less per month, and values are going up dramatically. This was at a point where there were more people moving into the city, in and around the city, and values were going up fairly quickly. So there was probably some luck involved that I hit the market at the right time. So
Hmm.
just to cut to the chase, I ended up selling I moved out, I rented it for a while, got good cash flow out of it, and then I ended up renting it to someone who was interested in buying it actually during the pandemic. And I thought about it for a while and went back to her and said, sure, I'll sell it. So I ended up selling it for around $420,000.
Wow.
The purchase, the contract was 80,000, but I had only $5,000 into it.
Yeah. So,
So
yeah,
so you
you're,
take the 80, of course I paid down mortgages and I leveraged it and I pulled money out and invested it in other things. I mean, it was fantastic. This is what you can do with real estate, right?
yeah,
And then sold it for $420,000. So if you take the delta from the contract price to the 420 and look at what I paid, the $5,000, that's where you get the 70x.
that's fantastic,
Because
man. If
I
only you could
only
just,
had the $5,000 in it. That was it.
that's the key. Yeah.
Right.
No,
The leverage.
structuring things where you have as little of your own cash in the deal as possible allows you to go and do it over and over and over and over again.
Exactly. And it's the leverage, which I think just for people listening, that is really an important point to keep in mind. You go out and get involved in other investments. There's not that kind of leverage involved,
Yeah.
right? In real estate, we can get debt because there's a real asset, and you're making money on that debt in addition to making money on the money that you put into it. And
Mhm.
that is a critical factor, and it is an enormous benefit with real estate.
It's paying down your debt. Your debt's going down. It's appreciating, building even more
Exactly.
equity, and it's cash flowing, putting money in your pocket. I want to talk about how you get your inspiration and then go into like how you balance the budget and the architecture and stuff like that. Cause that's definitely an art. There's not a science to it, but like where do you get the inspiration for your developments? I was on your website looking at some of the stuff that you've done. I mean, it's definitely unique. It stands out. Where does that inspiration come from?
Well, I mean, as I was mentioning, as part of my background, I'd like to consider myself a student of a lot of things, and I've always been very interested in architecture and architectural spaces, and it's been something I've studied, quite extensively. And while there are certain periods that I'm definitely more drawn to, mid-century modern architecture, it's the history of modernism. But I've been interested in architecture in many different places, in many different forms. In studying all of that, just gives you a greater understanding of how people have approached architecture with different needs and different purposes and different styles and different techniques of building over many centuries, right? I think all of those are worth looking at and trying to understand, because one thing is built on the next, right? You can go back to ancient Egypt or, Sumer, and see what was being built then, and certainly how that emerged into, where most of the Western canon started, which was ancient Greece, right?
Mhm.
Ancient Greek architecture is remarkable. I mean, I still would say to anyone that, the Acropolis in Athens and the Parthenon in particular is, one of the greatest architectural achievements in the history of humanity. It's absolutely extraordinary. But there are other examples like that that are always appealing to me. And I also I love experiencing the contrast of public spaces with architecture, right?
Mhm.
Because it informs the entire experience. You have fantastic public spaces that are created because of their relationship to architecture, right? The Piazza San Marco in Venice, for example, or the plaza in front of St. Peter's in Rome, or Trafalgar Square in London, or Red Square in Moscow. These are all remarkable spaces. And there's a power and a quality to these spaces that's created based on how the architecture has defined the spaces themselves. And that's always been, really of great interest and appeal to me.
Mhm.
Um, and when you look at each one, you understand something different. And you
Mhm.
start to think about, why are certain decisions made? What caused those decisions to be made? What were the designers or the artists thinking about in that process? And I would just go back to something I was saying before. Also, a lot of people feel when they're thinking about going to an art museum, well, that's something else. It's something other people do, right? Well, if we think about it, you build buildings, I build buildings, the people that made these, works of architecture did the same thing.
Mhm.
In a way, they're just like us. They're no different than we are. Same kind of people,
Mhm.
right? Different places, different times. So there's different demands on what they're doing, but the process is very similar. And our process is built on their process. So to think about it that way, and to actually think about the people that are actually building the buildings, it's a kind of insight, and it allows you to enter into the process. And then when you can think about different works of architecture over time, into how
Mhm.
we get to, at least the period that I do draw a lot of inspiration from, which is, the modern period. And there's a whole list of architects that I do find very inspirational from the 20th century. You can see how they developed.
Mhm.
In studying all of that informs one's thought process.
So you're looking at you've studied this extensively. You've got a background. You've visited very many different cultures. You've done
I,
the art. You get inspiration from the art that you kind of you ingest, and then you're looking at specifically like the modern architects who are kind of the thought leaders in the space. What are they doing? And then using that to, use your own brush and put your own mark on what you're creating.
You've got it. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I can
Now,
tell you just as an example, like I travel around and I'm with my kids, and they're like, stop photographing that.
yeah, yeah.
We got to go. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I got to look at this building. It's really interesting.
I did the same thing. I love architecture. The little scrolls on Facebook when I see like they figured out what I like, and it's like the really really cool buildings. So obviously, that you've got to make money, right? So a budget is a very important part of the project. How do you balance the budget with the design needs to really stand out? For me, like I love where you get your inspiration from, because me, man, I'm like the whatever if art's left brain, I'm right brain, or vice versa. I can't remember which is which, but like I'm just like, okay, let's see. All right, this person's building this in this area. They've sold a bunch of them. We're just gonna copy and paste it and maybe
Right.
tweak a few things. Like I unfortunately I do not do anything original. I'm like, who's already done it and what's working in the neighborhood. I'm like thinking about the risk perspective.
Yes.
But
Yes.
that's where you can charge more. If you're just kind of copy and pasting everyone else, you're going to make money like everybody else. Whereas if you can build a brand around something and create something that's exceptional, you can charge a lot more money for that. So how do you balance the budget with the design needs?
Well, you've hit on several points in what you just said that are worthy of a little bit more conversation, right? So I'll break it down a little bit. So, and I appreciate your approach that you're looking at what exists in the market, right? And you know those things are working in the market, and maybe you'll tweak a few things here and there, but from a business standpoint, right? You can go out and underwrite what you're doing, right? You can find comps for what exists. You can show investors that you're doing something that's relatively similar to what's there. And also you can go to whoever's building your buildings, right? Because they may have built those other buildings also. So they know how to do it. You're not giving them something that's really outside the box of what they know. So it's going to be likely easier for them to build it. So from a business structuring standpoint, all of that makes sense. But one thing that I'll go to as a point in thinking about that is, I asked a friend who's a terrific architect and designer, Jean-Gabriel Newcomb, about this. And I said, well, what do you do to kind of study in get some data on where people have what their tastes and preferences are, so that you can design to that, so that you know that what you're doing is kind of consistent with where the market is. And his response was, I thought, was fantastic, because he said, well, we do all of that, and we get as much information as we can, but all of that is actually retrospective. It's in the past, and we're trying to move things forward, right? Because there are new demands that we will have. And looking at some of his buildings, he was really pointing out, how public spaces are used and what people want in those public spaces. And those things haven't been done before. We're living in buildings differently now than we have in the past. So if we just rely on, what worked in the past, we're not going to be able to develop and innovate to build where we need to go in the future. So you have to kind of keep those things in mind in terms of what you're thinking about designing. And I definitely view it as the designer's responsibility to take those issues on and to move them forward. That's what designers do. They come up with innovative and unique solutions for existing problems, that even sometimes problems we didn't know existed, or problems that we know about, but we don't have solutions for.
Does a particular story come to mind around that example you gave that you'd be able to tell to like provide some context?
Absolutely. And I mean, and it's a story that we all know. And I can probably just tell the story in one word: Apple.
Okay.
So, but the story behind it is really that, Steve Jobs, while we all think that, or a lot of people think, he was an amazing inventor and innovator, the reality is that he took things that existed and he created a way of working with that. I mean, of course, there were advancements, no question about it, but he made them work for people. And he understood the value of design in that process. That, and if you look at, kind of the history of where it's obviously not the same anymore. I use a PC, the operating system doesn't look so different than a Mac, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the difference was unbelievable. The PC operating system, Microsoft, looked terrible. And the Apple operating system it looked beautiful. And it was more user friendly. It was more intuitive. It fit how we would think and how we use what we're working with. And then that, as part of the device, right, it opens up possibilities. You're not hung up on things that aren't working for you. You're just working seamlessly, and then you're getting someplace else. You have a beautiful experience, or an integrated experience with the computer, or now, then it's the iPhone, right? The first version of the iPhone was beautiful.
Yeah.
I no argument with it. And that's the story. You take something that already exists, that exists in a certain way, and you figure out how to make it so that people enjoy it. They appreciate it on a different level. And that's what design can give you. And Steve Jobs was brilliant at it. And I would say, I have maybe we're going to ask about this too, thinking about building the Tesla of homes. Tesla is another example of it. The cars are beautiful, and the importance of design in the product is critical. It's
Hmm.
part of its success, but it succeeds on many levels in a way similar to how the iPhone succeeded. It's multiple levels, and when you look at these types of objects, which I would say you could compare to actually building a building, that there are integrated systems in both, right? One's physical, you enter and it's done in a different way, but still
Hmm.
we have integrated systems when we're building we're building architecture, right? Single family homes, multifamily, commercial,
Right.
whatever it is, there's mechanical systems, there's electrical systems, there's plumbing systems, and now there's really advanced systems that can be applied to all of it depending on the kind of buildings that you're building, similar to the kind of advanced systems you have in a car or a phone. There's a relationship, right? But if it's all put together and designed well, meaning that those systems, they work beautifully, they're integrated beautifully, and they're all put together into something that creates a amazing experience for you as the end user, then that's where you get to something that really is elevated. And
Hmm.
you know it. Why does Apple sell so many iPhones, right? Tesla, I mean, it goes up and down, but they were the largest car company, at least at some point in the last couple of years, right? Selling only electric cars.
Yeah.
It's because there's an experience with it that gives you something
So
that's
how do you do that? I agree with
elevated.
100%. I think that everything going forward, if you're a restaurant, if you're in the hotel industry,
Absolutely.
and real
Absolutely.
estate, everything's about an experience, because that is ultimately what gets people to fork over their money. And really, it's not the experience, it's the emotions that the experience causes, that
Exactly.
causes people to pull the trigger. So how do you do that with architecture? Like, how do you, like, with design and architecture, what does the thought process look like when you're designing something and you're like, dude, I need this to be an experience from the moment they pull up to the moment that they leave?
Well, it is an experience. So I think the first point to keep in mind is that architecture is experienced by people, right? So you
Mhm.
think about it through your own perspective, your experience of a space and a place, in having thought through that experience in the past of looking at and studying other works of architecture is helpful in the process. So it gives you some, it's a language, right? You study music, there's a language to it. There's a language of forms, there's a language of space. And it's easy for it to get very complicated in relation to architecture because there's so many layers that are packed into it now.
Mhm.
You look at plans, right? It's like the plans for a building, goes from 10 sheets to 20 sheets to 30 sheets to 300 sheets. How do you kind of break it all down, and then where do you start? You start with your experience. What is the experience that you want to have with whatever it is that you're designing,
Mhm.
and start from there. And you can start by doing some drawings. You can start by looking at some source materials or other inspirational materials, and they can be a lot of different things. We put together mood boards. We'll find images of things that inspire our thought process, that evokes something that's the kind of experience that we want to have.
Mhm.
Could be a beautiful sunset or fall leaves or some flowers, or what are those experiences? And then by putting those together in relationship to actual materials, then you can develop a palette for a building. That's more of kind of the interior design part. So what about the actual spaces themselves? How do you think about those spaces? Well,
Mhm.
I tend to think in a certain way, particularly for residential architecture. I like high ceilings. I like larger windows. I want more space, more experience of space. I want you to be able to open your door and just have a kind of wow experience, like wow, I'm home, right? But then you need to fit that into what the envelope is. There's code, there's zoning, there's only so much you can build, and you have a cost structure. So you start with your ideal goal of what it is that you would like to achieve,
Mhm.
and then you break that down. It's like with any process, right? There's steps. So the design process you can break down into steps the same way that, once you start building, you have steps involved, right? It's like it seems so overwhelming, but if you break it down into the individual steps that you have to go through to build something, you can understand them.
So you're saying,
Right.
hey, here's the end result I want to achieve. This is the experience that that I want them to have while walking this home. And then you're taking that into account. You're like, I want them, maybe it's a smart home. And you're like, dude, as soon as they walk in, I want them to be able to say Alexa on, and boom, the lights
Absolutely.
and everything come on, the fireplace
Exactly.
starts, the AC comes on, etc. Or
Exactly.
as they round the master bedroom, you want it to feel like huge and vaulted. So you're going to, open space, vaulted ceilings. Maybe there's a cool view, and you're like, all right, we need to do floor to ceiling windows in this specific area. And so you're starting with that end goal in mind, like what is the experience that I need to give this person, and then basically reverse engineer that into steps during the design process.
Exactly. And also think about it this way, that it is a process, right? And when you're doing design work, you might move in one direction and then, well, that doesn't, you may not be happy with it, and you move in another direction. Like, it's an iterative process. You want to look at it and shake it up in different ways. And all of that then informs what you're doing. You
Mm-hmm.
need to see things, and then that informs how you think about it. And you just start by looking, and then start by gathering, and then start by drawing, or trying to figure out the concept and the feeling that you want to create, and then you'll develop and you'll build from there, one step at a time.
Very, very cool. Well, Aaron, this has been a pleasure. If people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
They can go to designdrivesvalue.com.
designdrivesvalue.com. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes there. And also, if you get a chance, check out Hive Development and Aaron's name. Like, he's got a super cool website, tons of awesome designs on there. I think
Like, we
you're
can give
working on some developments as
it's
well, right?
Yeah, so that's hivedevelopers.nyc. So we're working specifically in New York City at the moment, in Brooklyn. So you can check out our website in addition to going to designdrivesvalue.com, where you can download our ebook that is also called Design Drives Value, and it talks about how we approach what we do, as comparison to in contrast to the way a lot of buildings are built. And yes, we're working on two projects at the moment, total of 18 units. One is 8 and the other is 10 units, both ground up developments in Brooklyn.
Okay. And who is this like ebook specifically written for? Is it for people who want to like learn architecture, or is this for like investors to learn more about how you
It's
differentiate?
Yes,
Like, what is this ebook for?
exactly. It's definitely it's intended more for investors that are interested in finding more about how we think about what we do, and then also so that they can gain some understanding of the different types of investments that they would likely be looking at if they're looking into syndications. Because a lot of syndications are existing multifamily, and we want to just present why we're doing what we're doing and why it's different than existing multifamily investments. So that's the focus of it.
Okay, very cool. We'll make sure to put that. It was in the show notes, dude. This has been an absolute pleasure having you on today. I appreciate you coming on.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much, Brandon. It's always great catching up with you. Really appreciate it.